Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for our second Edufuturism Learning Series workshop. My name is Nick Covington. I'm the creative director at the Human Restoration Project. I'm also joined by our executive director, who is somewhere in relation to me on here, Chris McNutt. Chris, if you want to wave. HRP is an education nonprofit. We provide resources, professional development, podcasts, primers, all these kinds of things on topics related to progressive education. You can like, subscribe, follow us pretty much everywhere by searching for Human Restoration Project or at HumResPro. This Pay What You Want learning series is brought to you by our supporters, two of whom are Kimberly Baker and Brian Boren, who's joining us today. That's awesome. So the next two Futurism Learning series, just to preview those a little bit, will be on February 26th, and I'll preview them again at the end. Chris and I will be talking about elegant design, the mechanics of video games, and the mechanics of teaching. And then on March 11th, so a month from today, we'll actually be talking with Six to Start Game Studio CEO Adrian Hahn, author of You've Been Played, How Corporations, Governments, and Schools Use Games to Control Us All. And he'll be joining us for a Q&A on the successes and pitfalls of gamification. And of course, as you got the URL from our learning page here, you can learn more and register at humanrestorationproject.org/learning. So, like millions of other players, if you have any idea what the heck a quadrupus is, or if you've ever put in hours working for the Bureau of Shipping, you may know about our guest's work today. We're joined by Seth Coster, the co-founder and games designer at the indie game studio, Butterscotch Shenanigans. They're the creators of Quadrupus Rampage, Crashlands, Levelhead, and the upcoming Crashlands 2. The purpose of this learning series is to expand our understanding of what is possible in education by bringing in seemingly unrelated domains and having us work to make those connections. And my understanding is that Seth is going to help us rethink everything with games. You can find the link to their Discord community, which is awesome. Also, check out their weekly game dev comedy podcast and more at bscotch.net. Thank you so much, Seth, for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invite. I appreciate it. Like Nick said, I am Seth Coster. I'm a game designer, a game programmer, and studio head at the game studio Butterscotch Shenanigans. And so a few weeks back, Nick reached out to me to see if I'd be willing to run this workshop where, he pitched the idea of me bringing my perspectives about how some of the lessons that I've learned as a game designer could be, applied in an educational context. And that conversation was pretty fascinating. And it really made my gears kind of start turning in my brain because education has always been a subject that I've been very passionate about because of my sort of rougher history with my relationship with schooling as I was growing up. So I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and I went to a public school. And right away, I was able to read and write before I started kindergarten. But it turns out that that's kind of what you spend a lot of kindergarten doing, is learning how to read and write. So my first year in school, I just kind of hung out and just drew stuff with crayons and kind of waited, for things to catch up. And every year after in public school, it was more or less the same, where, a lot of my time was kind of spent waiting for things to happen. And I found that I kind of needed to do stuff to keep myself occupied and stay entertained and learn things. And so I kind of just did everything else too. I was on the football team. I did cross country, swim team, tennis. I was student body president, art club president, band, choir, marching band. I took college courses. I did plays. I was in drama. I did something called choral reading, which was one of the weirdest things I've ever done. For those who know about it, you know. If you don't know, that's probably good. And the background of all that stuff, I also got into building computers, and I started playing lots of video games, which I loved. And I also became super passionate about filmmaking, and I made lots of short films and even some full-length movies. And one of the films that I made in high school, we showed at the local theater in town, and we had a bunch of people come and watch it. It was great. So to pursue that dream of becoming a filmmaker, I went to the University of Southern California, which has an excellent film school. But after my enrollment, my application to the film school was rejected. And I entered a pretty deep depression after that. I had been working toward this for years. And then, they just kind of said, nah, we're just not going to let you study film here. So I had to figure out a new major. And I thought, well, if I can't make films, then I'll make video games. So I enrolled in computer science, and then I failed the intro course. And I had never failed a class before. So, this came right on the heels of that film school rejection. And this hit me pretty hard. And it was just a huge blow to my confidence. And it really convinced me at the time that I had kind of been delusional. I wasn't cut out to be a filmmaker. I clearly wasn't cut out to be a programmer. So I just gave up on both of those ideas. So now what do you do? So over the next few years, I didn't know the answer to that question. And so I transferred colleges twice. I changed majors 7 times. I ultimately got bachelor's degrees in economics and finance, but I just kind of was doing stuff, and so I wasn't sure what to do next after graduation. And I thought, well, okay, so if I can't make movies and I can't make games, maybe I can just make money. So I went to law school and I started a joint JD MBA program, and thought maybe that would be just like a safe route, right? It's the give up on your dreams and go be a lawyer signature move. So it turns out, though, that if you go to law school without any real interest in, the law, you're going to get bored real fast because you're just reading Supreme Court cases all day long. And it's very tedious. And if you're not really actually into that, then you're going to have a bad time. So once again, I was looking for something to stay engaged and entertained. And I had a chance encounter with a piece of software called Game Maker. And I started using this program to teach myself how to code. And it turned out that even though I had failed computer science, I actually had a knack for programming. It's just that the context was wrong at the time. So I started making my own little video games and publishing them. And within 14 months, I had progressed enough that I managed to land a job at a game studio in St. Louis. So I immediately dropped out of law school and business school and started my career as a game programmer. So later that same year, my brothers and I struck out to form our own game studio, Butterscotch Shenanigans, and we've been making games full-time ever since, accumulating tens of millions of players over the years and even winning some Game of the Year awards. And have been doing that for 11 years now. So although the particulars of my story are unique to my own path, I think that the overarching experience that I had is not uncommon. I felt out of place in school, and I was often bored and trying to find ways to stay engaged. And at some point, school even managed to convince me that I wasn't good enough to pursue the things that I really cared about. And it took years for me to rediscover my own confidence so that I could begin actually going down the career path that I really wanted. So all this kind of tells me that, something is not quite right. And I wanted to take this workshop as an opportunity for all of us who have a stake in this, to really rethink things from the ground up and try to take on some new perspectives about what's possible in the context of education. And I think this is a necessary approach because I believe that schools are currently trapped in something called a local maximum. And if we can't break out of that, then we're never actually going to see better results. So what's a local maximum? I'm glad you asked. Let's go on a little metaphorical journey. Okay. So imagine it's 150 years ago and you have a goal to reach the highest altitude that a human can go. But because of, the technology at the time, the only way that you can really think of to do this is to climb mountains. But you only know of a handful of mountains, the ones that are nearby. So you look around and you find what appears to be the tallest mountain and you start climbing. And when you reach the peak of this mountain, you can confidently say that you're not going to be able to get any higher. So did you achieve your goal? Well, no, because the peak of this mountain is a local maximum. It's not global. What you don't know is whether this is actually the tallest mountain in the world because you haven't explored the whole world. There could be a mountain just over the horizon that's 5 times taller than the one that you've just climbed, But as long as you stay parked right here, you'll never know. So you can spend the rest of your life, hunting for the tallest mountain in the world. But let's think back to our original goal, which is to reach the highest altitude that a human can go. Was the goal to climb the tallest mountain? No, we just got fixated on that method of gaining altitude. And by getting stuck to that one approach, we have limited our perception of what's possible. So in other words, the first mountain was a local maximum, but actually the entire concept of climbing mountains is yet another local maximum. To reach the true global maximum of highest altitude possible, we shouldn't be focusing on mountains at all. And instead we should focus on, aerodynamics. Because once we can make airplanes, we can go tens of thousands of feet into the sky without ever needing to put on climbing gear or think about any of the things that mountain climbing entails. So now we've done it. We've reached the global maximum and we can't possibly go any higher. Except it turns out that, airplanes are just another local maximum. If we pivot again and instead spend our time learning rocket science, we can go even higher than any airplane could ever hope to go. And we can go so high that our original goal of highest altitude possible kind of stops making sense, because it turns out you can go to the moon or Mars. And at that point, altitude isn't even a thing that we're thinking about, because now we're thinking about orbital mechanics, right? So at every step along this journey, we would hit a new height that looked like we couldn't go any higher. But once we were willing to let go of the methods and structures we used to get there, we discovered that there are entirely new ways to go far higher, and the new ways just don't look anything like the old ways. Okay. So what does this all have to do with school, and how does game design fit into it? So the reason I wanted to talk about local versus global maxima is that the idea of applying game design concepts to schools is not a new idea. For decades, people have been looking at how kids just love to sink hours and hours into video games, but they don't necessarily love to sink hours and hours into their studies and their homework and all that. And that's a natural comparison to make, right? So people have looked at ways to incorporate game design into schools by using gamification, which is when you just take some of the concepts that games use, like quests or leaderboards or something, and then you kind of just add those in to an already existing structure. But to kind of take it back to the metaphor, this is basically the equivalent of bringing a rocket fin with you on your next mountain climb, thinking that that's going to let you climb higher than the peak. It's not going to work. You're still stuck at the local maxima that you were stuck at before, because you haven't actually fundamentally changed your core approach. And if you want to go higher than you did before, you got to just come down off the mountain and start thinking differently and do something else entirely. So we're going to talk about game design principles, but to actually take advantage of these game design principles, we can't just slap them on top. We've got to rethink all of our assumptions from the bottom up. So the first thing that I want to drive home about game design before I lay out some of the principles that I want to talk about is that games aren't special. They're not doing anything unique or amazing that can't be replicated anywhere else, because at its core, a video game is just a constructed set of rules that create an imagined reality. But if we're being honest, that description actually just applies to pretty much everything that we do as people. Even if we're doing something real and important, like paying our taxes, we're engaging with a constructed set of rules and an imagined reality, because money's made up, the IRS is made up, laws aren't real. We made up the rules for all of this stuff. School is the same. We've got grades, semesters, midterms, lesson plans, lectures, detentions. Just like in a video game, these things are all made up. They're just rules that we've put together over time to create an imagined pocket of reality that we call getting an education. So if video games are actually just made of the same stuff as everything else, then what is the difference? Why do people engage with games so intensely compared to other things? Well, I think it's the simple fact that video games are unnecessary. Nobody needs them. And so game developers have had to figure out over the years how to make video games into a product that people just want. Because if you make a video game that's too hard or boring or punishing or impossible to figure out, people just put it down and go do something else. Nobody has to play your game. So you have to get really good at designing it so that people have a good time with it. So over the years, game designers have learned, I would say, not about game design, but about people. What motivates people, what excites them, what frustrates them, what do they look forward to, and most importantly, how do you teach something to someone in an engaging way so that they don't ignore it? Because of course, when you have a video game, you've made up everything, all the rules, and you have a lot of things to teach somebody before they can actually start having a good time, right? And over the past several decades, we game designers have learned and established a lot of conventions and principles that deal with us trying to answer these questions. Okay, so I'm going to get into the sort of interactive bit of the workshop. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to lay out some of the principles that we use as game designers. I'm going to cover 5 principles. And for each of these concepts, I'm going to introduce it, and then I'm going to invite some ideas from you all about how these are being used in an educational context, or how they're being misused or not used, right? And then we can hopefully we can talk about how we might shift things around and think about things differently using that principle to kind of rebuild things and start over. Okay. So first principle that I want to talk about is the concept of self-driven pacing. So ultimately, our goal as game designers when we make games is to match the player's skill to the challenge at hand. If the challenge is too easy, then the player's going to get bored and they fall off. And if it's too hard, they get frustrated and they also fall off. But we have to recognize at the same time that every player is unique and we don't know what they don't know. We don't know what they do know. We don't know how much time they have to play every week, or is this the first video game they've ever played? Are they a hardcore gamer who does speed runs? Are they colorblind? Do they have some kind of an issue, either physical or mental, that is going to make things more difficult to engage with? We don't know that. And so it's very difficult to create a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So to help with this, we try to make sure that our games allow players to move through the content at whatever pace works for them. And we think of this as a pull system instead of a push system. We create the challenges and they are there, but rather than push them onto the player, regardless of whether they're ready for it, we let the player pull the challenges in at a rate that they can handle. And in some cases, in an order that they prefer. So if somebody, wants to speed through things and has the skills to do it, the game can accommodate that. I'm sure, do you guys know about the game Breath of the Wild? You heard about it? It's a little indie game. There are players who've gotten so good at this game where they can just pick up a single stick and go all the way to the end boss and beat the whole game in 30 minutes. Most people don't do that. Most people want to take their time and go collect materials and learn how the game works and all that stuff. But the game actually is able to accommodate both of these approaches. And therefore, people will just keep engaging with it and keep playing it because they can adjust the challenges that they're facing by pulling it in a different way. So now I want to open up the floor for a couple of minutes. And we're going to use sticky notes on the Figma board. We can slap them onto this self-driven pacing section here, where I want to ask everyone here to provide your own perspectives about what systems or structures exist in a school context that don't adhere to this principle, the principle of self-driven pacing. where people get to choose what they engage with and how fast.
And real quick, for people who, hopefully you can hear me, but real quick for people who are new to Figma, if you kind of go into the top right corner of the board, we have a little tutorial page, but essentially down here at the bottom of the screen, even if you're looking at Seth's screen share, you can see that there's some sticky notes, nice. And you can just grab one of those sticky notes, you can drag and drop it into this space, cool. I see Chris Barber's got it on there. I've got one, Chris McNutt's got one on there. And that's where you can just add, if you're an educator joining us, you could add, how do the structures and systems of school that you have to adhere to as an educator, how do those things not allow students to choose their own pace? Or we've all been through some schooling at some point at K-12, higher education. You could speak to your own experiences of that too. So yeah, hopefully we can just see those.
Yeah, and don't worry about duplicates. Just if you think of something, put it on there, even if it, or if somebody else put it on, you can put it on there too. Just give it some emphasis. That's fine. Yeah, so we'll just give maybe like a minute. These don't have to be elaborate, just ooh, I like that little timer thing. It's great. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff here, so let's just kind of skim through it real quick. So we got core gen ed requirements for graduation. So every student's got to go through the same stuff, right? Regardless of their interests or goals or whatever. There is something to be said for getting a diversity of experience. We have the concept of like a liberal arts education where you learn about all kinds of different things and then you sort of specialize over time. But at the same time, we have this expansive set of diverse requirements that all students must meet, and they also have to do it in about the same amount of time, right? Which is kind of wild if you think about it. We have this concept of this was a pacing guide. You need to be in the curriculum by a particular time without regard to student learning. So it literally is like putting people on a treadmill and just kind of forcing them through the system, or even just the idea of of reading having a grade level, right? Like this is an 8th grade level of reading, except if you take a sample of all of the 8th graders, how many of them actually read at an 8th grade level? Probably just a small sliver, because a bunch of them are going to be above it, a bunch of them are going to be below it. So what does that even mean? These are all just sort of arbitrary benchmarks that we put in place, and it's all based on a lot of shoulds, which we'll talk about. A student should know this by this age, should know this by this age, should be able to do this by this point in time. And it's all about moving people through the system, right? So we also have the idea of length of classes. So this is, everybody's got to be in a lecture hall or whatever, listening to the professor or the teacher for the same amount of time. No ability to kind of like rewind that lecture, and you don't want to necessarily stop the class and say, hold on, can you kind of re-explain that whole section, because everybody's going to be waiting for you, and that's socially awkward. So no, if you miss something, you're just going to kind of hope that works itself out, right? Yeah, we got timed tests, which is something that is a kind of a strange thing that's pretty specific to an educational context. There aren't that many professional contexts where all of a sudden you have to demonstrate a huge amount of knowledge in like a 1-hour period with no ability to access outside resources. That's kind of a hyper specific school thing that doesn't really happen in very many other scenarios, right? And then we've got, moving through subjects based on grade level. We have the state enforcing certain curriculum requirements, all these things, right? So a lot of these things kind of, they, like we were talking about, they violate this principle of allowing students to move through at their own pace. And these things are also based on certain assumptions about student motivation and desire to actually engage with material. A lot of this stuff I feel is based on the idea that if you don't do this, if you don't push people through the system, then they won't move through it on their own. I don't believe that that's necessarily true, but I think a lot of these kinds of systems are kind of self-reinforcing, where the reason that you have to push people through the system like this is because there are so many other structures that make it very difficult to engage with the system and churn people out, So you have to kind of just force them to move through it, whether they want to or not, because that's the only choice that you have, right? So, keep all this stuff in mind. And what I like about all these notes that everybody put on here is that these things are pretty fundamental, right? Like these things are baked in to what we think about as this is what school is, right? You sit there in the lecture hall, you move through your subjects. In 8th grade, you do this thing, there's state curriculum, there's time tests, like all these things are just like woven into the fabric of everything that we think about when it comes to school. Okay, so let's talk about recoverable failure. So in video games, we try to carefully manage the player's relationship to failure. We have to recognize that failure is followed by a moment of emotional vulnerability in the player. Just like when I got rejected from film school and failed my computer science class, I entered into depression and I lost a lot of weight and I failed several other classes in the following months, right? Because I just got wrecked by this. So failure is hard, right? And depending on how our game responds to failure when we're making a game, we may cause the player to quit out of frustration, or we may cause them to be motivated to succeed. And I want you to really pay attention to the framing here because it's important. When the player fails, their reaction to the failure is our responsibility as designers. If they respond negatively, it's not a personal failing on their part. It's a design failure on our part. To keep the player motivated and engaged, even in the face of failure, we have to ensure that failure is a recoverable event without long-term consequences. So for example, if you're thinking about a game like Mario, if you hit a spike or a fish or a turtle or whatever, Mario dies, but really Mario just starts over at the beginning of the level. No harm, no foul. Or maybe you hit a checkpoint and Mario starts over, 10 feet back from where you just were. And in most, modern games, if you die a bunch of times trying to beat this level, it's fine. If you beat it once, you're good. And it doesn't matter if it took you 5 or 500 attempts to get to the end of it. The game is not going to punish you in any long-term way based on that fact. So we also want to make sure that the player gets the opportunity to recover quickly and that the cost of recovery is low. And sometimes games will get this wrong. Maybe you have a game where there's a checkpoint and then you got to defeat a whole bunch of enemies and then fight a big complicated boss fight. And if you fail at that boss fight, it's going to kick you way back to that checkpoint and you got to go fight through all those enemies again. And every time you do that, it's just several minutes before you can actually do the thing that you want to practice. And it just gets more tedious and boring every time, right? So even though the failure is recoverable, where, failing to beat this boss is something the player can just try again, you've escalated the cost of trying again, and you can disincentivize people from doing that. So if you do have these quickly recoverable failures, then this changes the mindset of the player because it puts them into a mode of experimentation and exploration. Mistakes are low cost and have no permanent penalty, so people are willing to do things. They're willing to try things that may not work out, and those mistakes or failures that come out of those experiments, they just become interesting lessons. They just become interesting things to reflect on and talk about, as opposed to something horrible that you now have to forever try to overcome. So once you have these recoverable failures, you'll find that players are just going to start spending a bunch more time in the game, and they're going to explore. They're going to find all the contours of the challenges, and they're going to do weird stuff that you never thought of because it's okay for them to do that. So let's go back to the Figma board and take 1-2 minutes to get some ideas on the board of what are some of the failure points in schools that students can hit. And are those failures recoverable, or are there long-term issues that come out of that? Okay. Oh, good stuff. Okay. So we've got a lot of this comes down to grades, right? We've got the idea of like final grades, averaging points across things. So, you can end a class and have 70%, right? And that's just part of your GPA now. You've got that, what is that? It's a C minus, I don't know, something. It's not great. And the ability for you to correct that low grade and sort of patch up your GPA, what do? You got to retake the entire class if that's allowed, right? And hope that you get something much better next time. But that's an entire semester worth of work, to fix something. And in some cases, maybe that class just had a midterm and a final. So, if you could just retake that final, then maybe you'd be fine. If you just got an extra week to kind of study up on the things that you missed, right? But without having the ability to easily do that and retake things and try again for things that you missed, your grades no longer become a vehicle through which you can assess how well you did. They become punitive, right? So it's a lot like, how in a weird way, how in some different countries view their prison systems differently, right? In some cases, it's about punishment, and in other cases, it's about rehabilitation, right? And helping people get their lives back on track and figure out what went wrong and make corrections, right? And so you have to recognize that anything that you have in your system that doesn't allow people to experiment, make these mistakes, and recover from them, like GPA, grades, non-retakeable tests, all that stuff. All that comes together to make it so that students are incentivized to cheat. They're incentivized to do whatever it takes to get those points, because those points are not recoverable. The cost of getting them back is super high. And then you have to spend a lot of your time as an educator, as a teacher, trying to reinforce and fix all the collateral damage that's caused by the rigidity of an unrecoverable failure system, right? Students are always arguing about their grades. You're watching for things like plagiarism all the time, because if a student doesn't think they can figure out how to do it, they still need the grade and there's still a deadline, right? So you've put them into that situation, and they're responding with, whatever tools they have on hand, which in some cases is cheating, right? So yeah, this is all super good. Thanks for the notes on that. Okay, so let's talk about feedback. Okay, and a lot of these things are going to have lots of overlapping domains because they all talk to each other and work together. So another way that we can manage and control our players' reaction to failure and to the rest of the game world is by ensuring that we have clear feedback systems. And this is the idea of having your actions result in an outcome that you can understand and then use as information going forward. So there are three main cornerstones of good feedback. So the first one is speed. It has to be fast. When you do something, if you instantly get a response, then you know that response is connected to the thing that you did, right? So if you, on the flip side, let's say you've got a game where the player can earn points by doing good things as they progress through the game, but you don't show them the points they're getting in real time. And then just in like a 5-minute increment, you just say, hey, here's all the points you earned in the last 5 minutes. Well, the player doesn't have any idea, what specifically they did got them those points. And as a result, they literally cannot be motivated by this point system that you have, because their actions have no discernible connection to the points, right? Feedback also needs to be understandable. And by that, I just mean it's got to be understandably connected to something that has happened, right? It can't be arbitrary, basically. So, let's say you got the ability for the player to take damage on their character, but it feels like they're taking damage at random and they can't quite figure out why. Now, as a designer, you may say, I know why. I put spikes in the level and they keep touching the spikes, right? Well, it's possible that the spikes blend in with the surroundings and it's super hard to tell what's going on. And so the player just keeps stepping on them because they can't figure it out, right? So if you make them big, paint them red, all that stuff, the player will see the spikes, they'll make the connection, right? And they'll be able to avoid them, right? So it's possible that you have something that you believe is a feedback mechanism, but it's being obscured by something, and it's hard for the user to actually recognize that this is what it's connected to. And then the last thing is the feedback has to be noticeable or has to be obvious, right? So if you have a situation like the spike situation, right, where the player is taking damage, but they may not even recognize they're taking damage because you don't have any sound effects, you don't have any screen shake, you don't have any, flashy things happening when that important event occurs. And so the player is a person who is paying attention to all kinds of other things, right? And if this feedback isn't obvious, it gets overshadowed by every other thing that the player is thinking about and doing at that time, and they can't use it, right? Because they can't see it. So if your feedback does meet all these thresholds where it's fast, it's understandable, it's noticeable, then when something goes wrong, the player will only blame themselves because they have all the information and they're able to quickly recognize what they did that was bad or good. And then they can adjust their approach next time to do more good stuff and do less bad stuff. So if you don't do this, then your player will over time, or in some cases immediately, lose the desire to keep going forward because their actions don't produce knowledge. And therefore, they have no hope that they'll be able to get a better outcome the next time they have to do this thing. All right, so back to the board. What are some of the feedback systems that schools provide to students to let them know that they're doing something good or something bad? Are they learning? Are they making mistakes? Are they misbehaving? Whatever it is. And are there ways that those feedback systems are too slow or too hard to understand or arbitrary, right? Or too hard to notice for a student? Should have found a way to hook up the Jeopardy theme song during this segment. Okay. Yeah, so Nick says that schools provide a lot of feedback, but it's just not that fast. It doesn't necessarily tightly adhere to all these concepts. It's there, but it could be better, right? So we have Chris saying that grades are common poor feedback. They're fast, well, sometimes fast, right? So you might may turn in a paper, or you write the entire paper, and you turn it in, and then you get a grade on the whole thing, right? Yeah, what does an A in my class mean to another teacher? Man, that's another problem, is that people will bias toward taking classes that give easy A's, right? Because they got to get the grades, and it's sometimes hard to tell in some classes based on the teacher's own personal style or biases or whatever. It's hard to tell what it would take to get the A, right? And so in those cases, you're going to just bias toward trying to not take that class or not take the class with that teacher. And instead, you're going to seek out stuff that gives you the easy grades. Now, large class sizes. So if you got a lot of cohorts, a lot of other students in your class, then your teacher just can't really give you one-on-one stuff. A lot of this is based on the assumption that it's the teacher who gives the feedback, which is a scaling problem, right? So as long as you've got a teacher grading things and a teacher who has a class full of X number of students, there's a bottleneck there, right? So you don't have, for example, if you're writing a book report, you can't write the first page of it and get feedback on that first page and say to your teacher, hey, how's this looking? Any ideas? I was thinking I would take it this way. Am I on track? You can't do that because the teacher is overwhelmed, right? They've got 30, 60, however many students. And if every student was just continuously asking for, progress reports and all that stuff, then the teacher wouldn't be able to do anything, right? So there are some other structures in place that reinforce the inability of a school to give this kind of fast, instantaneous, small batch feedback. And it all comes down to just how the whole thing is put together. It assumes a one-to-many relationship of students, or of teachers to students. And if the feedback can only come from one place that has that is a bottleneck of information, then you're going to have a problem, right? Yeah, and this is part of it too, like what Rachel said, giving feedback at the end of a project instead of during. So like I was saying about writing something and being able to talk about what it is that you're doing while you're doing it, you know? Yeah, assessments in 2 weeks. Yeah, so this is, a lot of this comes down to grades. There's also some other feedback systems like detentions, right? You make them, you do something bad in class, and now I guess your parents get punished by having to come pick you up after school or whatever. And it doesn't necessarily do anything to mitigate the behavior. It's thought of it as a punitive measure to try to deter it from happening. And it doesn't necessarily get at the root cause, which is a much deeper set of questions and problems, right? Oftentimes relating to things outside of school and that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty messy space to be in, right? But I just wanted to draw attention to the idea that a lot of the feedback mechanisms that exist in schools exist because of the other structures that we have built. And to everyone's credit, I think what we have is, it's a local maxima, right? It's the best we can have given the situation we've put ourselves in. But if we change some other things, then we can also rethink how it is that we give feedback to students. All right. So next up, we'll talk about the concept of hard gates. So I think it's kind of simple in retrospect, but it's worth exploring. And to illustrate what this means, I'm going to use a counterexample first. Okay, so let's say we're making a video game, and in the first level of this game, there's a magical chest full of goodies, powerful items, loot, all kinds of stuff. And also, a few things that aren't that important, some weaker items or whatever, less desirable things. So we could, if we wanted, design a complex way for the player to open this chest. So maybe we give the player a bunch of spells that they have to cast in a certain way or in a certain sequence to get this chest open. And even if they do kind of a bad job of casting these spells, the chest will still open, but they'll just get less stuff or less good stuff. Okay. So, meanwhile, another player could come in, cast all the spells perfectly, cast them in the right sequence with the right timing, blah, blah, blah. Boom, that player gets all the goodies. They get the powerful items. They get everything out of this chest. Okay. So this concept creates some problems. For starters, there's a feedback issue, which is the player's got to do a whole bunch of things, and then they're still going to get something out of it. But it's not obvious exactly how tightly coupled that is to what it is that they did, right? So that's kind of a confusing and dissatisfying thing for the player to engage with. But on top of that, as designers, we've given ourselves a huge problem. Because if we put something useful in that chest, an important item, it'll be really nice to have later on in the game, but some players never got it because they cast the wrong spells or whatever, then when we go to design level 2 or level 3, we can't design those levels with that powerful item in mind. We have to kind of keep it very simple and easy so that in case somebody missed that, they can still progress, right? So now the players who did do a good job and got that powerful item, they will find that the later levels are very easy and boring because they're very strong and they can just blast right through it, right? So this isn't good. But if we switch this spellcasting chest opening system to a hard gate, then it'll look different. So hard gate is just a progression system that instead of being complex, it uses a simple yes or no question to determine whether the player advances. It's all or nothing. So in the case of this magical chest, get rid of this convoluted spell casting thing and just put a key somewhere. The player finds the key, they open the chest, and if they open the chest, they get all the loot, right? And then just to be sure, we can also make it so that they can't get past the end of this level until they've opened that chest, right? So now we know every player is going to open that chest. If they've beaten level 1, they have the item from the chest, and now we can build level 2 in a way that's much more tightly balanced and is much more satisfying for everybody because we know what they have coming into it, right? So this is much more simple and understandable for the player. The concept of a key in a chest is very straightforward. They have good feedback because they just plug that key in and they get stuff, right? It works great for us as designers. It's win-win-win across the board, right? So let's think about this now in the context of schools. So for starters, what are the progression systems in a school? How does a student move through the stages of their education? And are those hard gates, or is a player moving through without necessarily getting all the powerful items along the way, right? All right, so we'll do about a minute and a half. Okay. So a lot of things in here, good diversity of things, because like we talked about earlier, the pacing is not necessarily self-driven in a school and people just kind of move through, right? So like Nick is talking about here, the conveyor belt kind of batch processing nature of things means that the goal of the system is to actually keep people moving, right? And so if you get a 70% in every class, you can graduate, no problem, right? But as you move from class to class, there's a full third almost of the material that you apparently didn't master, and you just keep moving forward, right? So this becomes a big problem for teachers later on, because if they have 10 students in their class and every single one of them got a 70% in the prior class, each of those students may be missing a different 30% of the knowledge, right? And so you've got to just recap stuff all the time. You got to revisit topics that you thought that people should have known by now, but they don't. And it's not their fault. They don't know it because they were encouraged to just get by based on the system, right? They're going to graduate. They're going to get through as long as they kind of just hit those thresholds, which means that they're going to have a bad time because, they're missing stuff. And as they miss more and more things and keep moving through the system, they get more frustrated. On the flip side, teachers have a bad time because they just can't accommodate, as the grade levels go up, they can't accommodate such a diverse set of starting knowledge for all the students that come into their class. And this kind of applies to everything, almost fractally, where even at the fundamental level, if you miss a lecture, life goes on, right? You just go right into the next lecture the next day. And you're not stuck where you were. It's not like, oh yeah, you're not going to move to this next lecture until you go through this previous lecture, because again, it's all about, there's a teacher in a room with students and the show must go on, right? So all these structures kind of push us into a place where if we wanted to have hard gates, we would have to get away from the idea of moving people through the system and instead letting people move themselves through the system, which means the idea of a batch lecture classroom with a bunch of students in one place, one-to-many teacher-student relationship, all that stuff. You can't really do it and also have hard gates, right? So you kind of have to rethink a lot of things, even the concept of lectures and classrooms, because they just don't necessarily fit here, right? And then there's even things like admissions, being denied access to to a college or a program, it's a hard gate in the sense that you didn't get to proceed. But on the flip side, the mechanism by which you pass that gate is a very complex one, right? With terrible feedback and lots of unrecoverable mistakes. If your GPA is bad, it just is bad. And good luck getting into colleges. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So there's just all these traps, right? All right, so I got one more principle to cover and then a wrap up. So I know we're kind of coming up on the hour, but we'll
And I think
finish
that's
this.
fine. We can go maybe 5 or 10 over since we started a little bit later. So we
Yeah,
can flex it.
Okay. So this last one is, I think, one of the coolest, which is the idea of information value. All right. So this is the idea that our brains don't treat all information equally. And I admit that, it seems like it would be better to know the quadratic equation than to know all the lyrics to Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," right? But sometimes your brain has other ideas about what information is important. So as game designers, we have a golden rule about players, which is that you can't tell them things ahead of time because they either won't listen or they won't remember. Now, we could complain about this and we could talk about how players should take the time to read stuff and that they should listen to the instructions that we give them. But should doesn't get you anywhere because should is a denial of reality. If we want to design a system that works for the player, we can't afford to get on a soapbox about all the things that they should do. We have to just try to understand what they actually do. So one of my favorite examples of this is from back when we were working on our game Quadrupus Rampage, where in this game you play an underwater kind of a cephalopod thing, and you're battling an army of evil fish monsters. And we gave the player a button that lets them zoom around using their ink, sort of like they can zoom around and dodge around. And we found that a lot of our players were having a harder time in this game because they actually didn't realize that that button was even there. They didn't know that they had this ability. So we thought, easy solution. We'll just put some text in there, like just in the game, that tells them how this thing works. Because if you want someone to know something, you just tell it to them, right? So we put some enormous text right smack in the middle of the screen that just says, use your inkjet to dodge. And this text was huge and it was annoying because it obstructed your view of the game and of your character and everything. So we also made it so that this text would stay there forever until you pushed that button. Okay. So we patted ourselves on the back and we were like, we did it. We solved the problem. But later we were horrified when we came across gameplay footage that a player had uploaded where this player managed to play for 4 hours with that text in the way, and they never noticed that it was there. It's kind of like when you're looking through a chain link fence and your brain just kind of deletes the fence so that you can look past it. We put those words on top of everything and the player's brain just allowed them to look right through it. So why? So we went back to the drawing board and we started looking at how lots of other games handle this kind of problem. And we figured out that we were just going about it backwards. There's a 3-step process to teaching players things. Step 1 is we have to give them a problem to solve. They have to recognize that there's a problem. Step 2 is you don't necessarily have to give them the answer. Let them do some stuff. Let them experiment and try to solve the problem on their own. A player might just hit that button naturally while they're trying to figure out how to do something, right? And once the player has reached a point where they recognize that there's a knowledge gap or a skill gap and they actually can't solve the problem with the tools that they have, then they will start to look for information about how to do that. And it's your job as the designer then to ensure that you've provided access to that information. So in the case of Quadrupus Rampage, we just needed to add some small gaps in areas of the game that you wouldn't be able to get to unless you used your ink dodge move. And only if a player got stuck there for a little bit too long should we pop the text up and explain to them how to do it. So when we teach players in this way, we find that the new knowledge sticks very easily because we've primed the player to treat that information as high value. They recognize they have a problem, they want to solve the problem, and now they're actively seeking the knowledge that they need. So if you flip it, if you give the player the information first and then give them the problem to solve, the information won't stick because they just have no reason to care. And therefore the information is low value. And this is that oldest time phrase you hear in school. What am I ever going to use this for? I'm sure we've all heard it or said it. If you're hearing that question or asking that question, it's because there's a design problem. People are not going to be receptive to information that they can't fathom the purpose of. So as designers, we need to prime this. We need to prime people to want the information. And to do that, we have to be willing to put them into a situation where they can't succeed unless they get it, which also means that the player is going to fail at first, which means that failure has to be totally fine, right? So all these things feed back into each other. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about information value in schools and how is information delivered to students in schools, and is that structure likely to make the information perceived as high value or low value with these approaches. Okay, so yep. So a lot of this comes down to the idea of lectures, presenting information up front. Like Chris said, most classrooms tend to follow this bad game tutorial model where you just don't let people do anything. In some cases, I don't know if you guys have seen these games where they just freeze the whole screen. They don't let you do anything at all, and then they just explain to you the whole game. And then they just set you loose, and then you're just confused as hell for the rest of the time. Because of course it's, people learn things almost like a CPU. It's a linear sequence, right? One thing at a time. And if you hit people with 16 new things all at once, they can't synthesize it that fast, right? I think reasonably. So a lot of this comes down to this model of park students in a room, tell them everything, give them homework, they do the homework. And at some point, that thing may come up on a test again, and then moving on, right? In my own experience, the most engaged I ever was in school was when I was studying finance toward the end of my college career. And I had this professor who only taught through case studies, where we would start working on a case. And it was usually a fairly complex problem where it's this business is trying to do this thing and they can't figure it out. They can't figure out what their next move should be. Here's a bunch of their financial information. See what you can come up with. And these case studies were always set up in such a way that we had to solve the problem and present our solution before we actually ever learned about what the right way to solve it was. And then the professor would seize upon our assumptions and our mistakes, and then use those as points to kind of to illustrate the new information and how it works in that new context. And it was great. I loved it, and I felt like I was super engaged, and it was fun because it also allowed us to try to figure things out on our own and apply the knowledge, in a way that we thought made sense, and intuit it. And then, the professor was able to come in and sort of fill those gaps. And it was actually as a result of that class that I decided to become a chartered financial analyst, because it was just great. It turned out I didn't want to be a financial analyst, but I had a great time in that class. So this is part of the issue, right? It's that the structures that we use to teach actually work in direct opposition to the way that people seem to learn, right? So it's something that we really need to think about. And all right, so I need to kind of wrap up, but I want to talk about one last thing, which is just the problem of change in general. So a lot of the stuff we've talked about, it all feeds back in on itself and demonstrates that you can't necessarily just change one piece of it, because every piece of the system we have is built in the context of the existing system. And we're just doing stuff to try to compensate for mistakes that are baked in, right? Which means that if you really want to try some big experiments to actually capitalize on these ideas, you have to be able to make big changes, right? And I'm sure everybody here is thinking the same thing, which is, yeah, that would be great. It would be great if we could just, change everything. But you can't do that because there are constraints, right? I think that, yes, there are constraints, but you can change everything on a long enough timeline, as long as you're strategic about the approach and realistic about why the constraints are there, and learn how to kind of strategically change things in a way that still allows things to fit. So, first of all, I think we have to recognize that people both demand and hate change. And by and large, people would mostly rather keep things the same and not take a risk on doing something new, even if they're totally unhappy with how things are currently going. But that's not always true. There's always some people somewhere, like in this very Zoom call, right, who have reached a point where they say, okay, enough. Let's do something. We have to do something. We have to do something different. So the first step is to find somewhere where you can find those people and get the buy-in to shake things up and try some of these new ideas. And if you're an educator, some of those people might already be there in your school, and you just need to reach some kind of a critical mass. And with that buy-in, you can work together to pitch sort of a pilot program. And of course, a top to bottom rebuild is out of the question. It always is, right? Which means you have to propose some kind of a phased rollout. You try to figure out, okay, everything in the system is interdependent, but there must be one or two things that we can change that have, minimal spillover effects on other things. And if those work out, you'll have check-ins. If those work out, you can figure out what the next phase of implementation is, as long as you understand the broader set of changes that you're trying to get at. But even then, even if you get that internal buy-in, you still have the problem of external dependencies. Like a giant jigsaw puzzle, our educational system is made up of all these interlocking parts that all assume that every other part is going to be doing the same stuff and is going to look the same and stay the same. So if one piece changes shape, it's going to create big problems for everybody. For example, colleges assume that any given school has a GPA concept or letter grades. So they're going to ask for transcripts to evaluate who are they going to let into their school. Let's say you've made a big change to your school and you said, you know what, we're not doing letter grades anymore because, maybe we say people can just keep retaking stuff until they get 100% in it, and then they can move on to the next thing. Well, in that case, everybody has an A+, right? For all the things that they've done, everybody has aced it. So you don't even have grades. So what do you do when your students want to apply to college? Well, in software engineering, we run into this type of problem all the time where, we've written a program that other programs need to talk to, just like how schools and colleges have to exchange information. And invariably, there's going to come a time where you have to update your software. Maybe you need some new features or some bug fixes or whatever. Whatever that change is, you have to be able to change your software while still making sure that third-party programs can still talk to it and get the information that they expect. So to do that in software engineering, we make something called an API, an application programming interface. So the API is just a set of questions and commands that external programs send to your program so they can get information from it or ask it to do something. And once you've got an API, you can make all kinds of internal changes to your own program. And as long as other people can still use the API and get the information that they expect, it doesn't really matter to anybody else that everything has changed under the hood on your end. So, in the case of colleges asking for transcripts, this is just an API request where the college says, we want to evaluate students based on letter grades or GPA. And all that means is that your school needs to be able to deliver a document called a transcript that adheres to that format. Under normal circumstances, if your school just has letter grades, you just send the document, right? But if you don't have letter grades, you just got to come up with some way to make that document. You need a conversion system, right? So whatever that means, you just need a formula to convert it. However, you're going to measure a student's performance to a letter grade based on the systems you have now. You can send that to third parties, and you've preserved the API, and your jigsaw piece still fits in the puzzle, and everything is fine. So with this way of thinking, you can be more free to make internal changes because it's not going to cause problems or disruptions to third parties. As long as everything looks kosher from the outside, you can do all kinds of wacky things on the inside. So, of course, none of this is easy. It's extremely complicated and takes a lot of thought and design work and iteration and time. But I believe that it can be done because everything as it currently exists, we made up, right? We invented all the rules as they currently stand. And with enough time and energy, I think we can do it again. I think we can change the rules. So thank you all for the opportunity to come talk about this stuff today. Once again, my name is Seth Coster. And if you'd like to follow up and talk further about any of this stuff, I'm happy to do that with anybody. So this is my email. Shoot me an email. Don't tweet at me or anything. I don't use any of that stuff. Just send me an email. That's fine. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, virtual round of applause here for Seth. Thanks so much for taking the time and obviously putting that together, walking us through it. I know I'm not alone in saying that I feel like I could just listen to you go for like a 4-hour chunk of time without.
I'd be so hoarse.
That's true. But again, as I had said at the beginning, they do the Coster Bros at Butterscotch do have a weekly game dev comedy podcast that is definitely worth listening to. I feel like I just learned something new every time. Now, your last comment too, Seth, there about everything's made up really brought me back to a quote from David Graeber, who was I guess economist, anarchist, kind of futurist thinker. And he says, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. And that has kind of just been a thought for me kind of as going about education work. So perhaps that can be an interesting closure as well. So with that said, Seth, if you could just go down to the bottom of that Figma real quick, I can just give a shout out to the upcoming sessions would be cool. So a quick reminder that these are bi-weekly for as long as we can run them. If you found this one valuable, there are a couple other ahead of this that I put in the link to the chat. Chris and I talking about designing for emotion and kind of using video game tutorials. A lot of intersections with what Seth was just talking through today. I think his workshop is like the central through line for that, and Chris and I may be tackling some of the specific parts of it. But the next one's about elegant design and mechanics, which certainly came up, in the course of Seth's workshop, and then talking about the issues with gamification, the pros and cons with Adrian Hahn there a month from now. But yeah, I'll put the link to the rest of those in the chat. And yeah, if you want to go to bscotch.net, of course, you can follow Seth and the Butterscotch community there. You can join their awesome Discord. If you go to humanrestorationproject.org, you can check in with us, get involved. We've got a Discord community as well and all of that. So again, thanks all for taking time today. Thank you so much, Seth, for joining us. And
yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, we'll restore humanity together. So thanks so much, folks.